organized veterinary medicine is part of civics.
So I totally agree with you. Organized professionals, organized organizations.
Yes.
They're all part of that government that we're talking,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Everybody keeps thinking the government is Congress. No, the government is us.
Yes.
And
of the people, by the people, for the people.
That's right. And so if we don't police ourselves, then we would need a lot more agencies, a lot more regulations. And so the CVMA isn't just an advocacy organization for the profession. It is also a profession that reminds all of its members, this is how you're supposed to act as a professional veterinarian.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations podcast.
A series of conversations about social justice and racial issues that began after the death of George Floyd.
Welcome back. This week's episode is a continuation of the last, a civics lesson, part 2. Enjoy and please share.
Right. No, it's interesting, and again, we've talked about the lessons that you saw and the issues that you saw from a voting and guessing the marbles or whatever the paper bag stories were, and all of the different challenges that Mississippi was going through at that point in time, which brings us back to where this all started, which was right to vote, efforts to second guess democracy and the demolition of the keystone of American democracy and the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it is an interesting civics lesson that we have shared today, hasn't it been?
Yes, absolutely. The importance of reintroducing civic lessons.
Yes.
So essentially, back to your question again. The solution that President Nelson would implement would be civics lessons at different stages, at multiple stages, counter propaganda, essentially. But I don't consider it propaganda when I'm focusing on principles, when I'm focusing on the higher purpose.
I'm going to tap into your background as a boarded internal medicine specialist and my knowledge as a veterinarian and education, in the sense that we focus from an immunology standpoint on an anamnestic response.
Yes.
And that's how we benefit pets when it comes to vaccinations.
Yep.
That's how we benefit people when it comes to vaccinations. And I have talked to you about the need to do so from an education standpoint so that lessons aren't just learned once, tested, and forgotten, that there is a constant retesting and re-education of our immune systems or our brains so that it becomes a part of our DNA, for lack of a better way to put it. And I think what happens in our education programs way too often is you get some dirt underneath your fingernails and you got a small amount of immune stimulation, but maybe we need to eat some dirt and maybe we need to eat it more often. And maybe we need to have a little bit of an anamnestic approach to education on things that will have long-term implications, civics being one of them, government being another. And if you start to look at even healthcare education, it is so focused and so narrow that 4 years of a professional education, there's very little discussion of government and civics in there. But everything we do, every action we take is under some sort of regulatory body that's a governmental agency. Well, how did it get there? And how do we deal with all of this?
Well, I can't counter any or agree with just about everything you said, although I'm not one that likes the parsing of this strategy. You know, our curriculum at Western is largely experiential. And the one thing that you said that really resonates with me is that whatever we're teaching during a human being's formative years, it needs to be relevant to whatever's happening. Otherwise, they're not going to remember it. So your anamnestic response analogy hits home, right? Meaning you inoculate them with the knowledge, but they better get a chance to apply it. And they better get a chance to apply it soon. But even when they get a chance to apply it, all that means is that that's the next teachable moment. Just as our immune system, when we train a T cell, the first generation of T cells binds to the antigen rather loosely, but then they learn more about the receptor that they're binding to, and the next generation is a better fit for the receptor.
Yeah, well, that's immune memory, right?
That's right. And it binds better and it kills better. And then the next generation is even a better fit. And after 2 or 3 generations, you got super glue, on the T cell, and you can't dislodge it once they find their antigen. Well, we should see education the same way. But I also thought it interesting that you split civics and government. And I don't split the two. I can't. They're the same thing. Again, if FDR says we are the government, then civics is just how you use government, how you make government part of your life. And when you do, you don't have to have regulating agencies for every part of your life, because you can regulate yourself. And that's the one part of the debate that I'm in total agreement with the Republican Party. But at the same time, I acknowledge that human beings are greedy, that human beings are selfish, that power corrupts, and that needs to be held in check. And that's why we have a check and balance system in our government that almost got obliterated in 4 years, because that power and that selfishness and that greed was put to use to wipe out those checks and balances. And we have now seen what can happen when a person of avarice does not hold to those sacred principles and allows personal gain to fetter their own behaviors.
See, I look at government as a what and civics as a how.
Yeah, I do too, but I see them intertwined.
Yeah, well, I think that you can't separate them. They are the 2 strands of DNA.
Exactly. The twisted helix.
Yes, the double helix, yes. And I wasn't suggesting that it's the responsibility of a professional curriculum to teach civics or government.
Oh, no, I didn't take that.
Yeah, maybe there is a responsibility, though, that we as senior veterinarians, DVMs, or even lawyers, there is a responsibility to let our next generation know about the prior generations. And that's where the government, organized veterinary medicine, organized law, organized medicine, maybe hasn't done as good a job in helping students understand that they're part of a bigger program. And I'm not blaming schools or anything about that. I would actually blame organized veterinary medicine for not being more engaging in it. But listen, I know I'm involved in organized veterinary medicine, and I became involved because I was told that it was that important when I was in veterinary school. But organized veterinary medicine is part of civics.
So I totally agree with you. Organized professionals, organized organizations.
Yes.
They're all part of that government that we're talking,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Everybody keeps thinking the government is Congress. No, the government is us.
Yes.
And And
of the people, by the people, for the people.
that's right. And so if we don't police ourselves, then we would need a lot more agencies, a lot more regulations. And so the CVMA isn't just an advocacy organization for the profession. It is also a profession that reminds all of its members, this is how you're supposed to act as a professional veterinarian, right? And you do know there's a veterinary medical board, right? You do know that. So, if you want to stay out of their crosshairs, then here's how we behave. Right. And we're the gentle reminder. That's all part of government. That's all part of doing it the right way. The difference is that there are teachable moments at every stage of your life. And I want to advocate a little for veterinary education. I believe, I don't, well, on the one hand, you kind of, you criticize education for not teaching a little government or the role of the student, in this, but then you turn around and say you were told how important organized veterinary medicine was. They were teaching government when they told you that, right?
Absolutely.
And knowing the deans that I've known, even before I became a dean, there has always been an attempt to mold the whole person. Now, what I have to be critical of is that we never brought politics to the campus. And not only that, we wouldn't bring politics to AVMA. You didn't talk about that. Now we're beginning to talk about it because we realize it is part of our DNA. We realize we are ignoring it, and by ignoring it, we can't address mental wellness. When I was a kid, one of my sisters had asthma, and my father was the only person who could drive in the family. And we lived on the north side of town, but Jackson State was on the south side of town. And he needed my sister to be close to him in case she had an asthma attack. And at that time, there weren't aerosolized medications that you could use very readily. She had been an asthmatic for 4 or 5 years. But anyway, when she had an asthma attack, we had to take her straight to the doctor. So we went to school, in elementary school, close to him. We went to work with him so that we could go to school rather than going to school in our neighborhood. And after school, we would walk from the elementary school to the cafeteria. He was director of food service, and we would do our lesson in his conference room where he would have meetings. So as a 10-year-old, I got a chance to listen to his meeting because my job was to keep my sisters quiet while we did our homework. And I didn't know this then, but I learned a lot just listening to him have these meetings. And one of the meetings he would have at the beginning of each school year was with the new cooks and dishwashers that they had just hired. And he would call them all in and welcome them to Jackson State. And he would tell them, look, I know how hard your job is. We make 40, 50 pounds of grits in a 20-pound iron cast pot that's 20 pounds even when it's empty. Then we have to take it off that stove and it's hot and bubbling stuff. So I realize this isn't an easy job, but I want to welcome you. But I want you to understand what you're doing. Your job isn't really to cook. I mean, yes, you're cooking, but you're nurturing these students. And these students are our future. They're learning what we should have learned, and they're going to move our race forward. And so I need you to understand how important your job is, because this is where they get nourished. This is where they gain the nourishment they need in order to learn. So you are as important as these teachers are. Now, what that means is when you come to work, I need you to pick up their spirits too, not just their physical nourishment, but they need mental nourishment. I want you to learn these students' names. I want you to ask them how they're doing. And if you have a problem at home, don't bring it to work. They don't need your problems. I got to know this speech pretty well. And I told him, I said, Dad, at one point I said, Dad, why do you keep telling them this isn't a job? I mean, because it is. He said, and I told him, I said, I tried to pick up one of those pots. I can barely pick them up when they're empty. These tall colanders that you cook your grits in and stuff. And he said, yeah, I know, son. He said, but I've learned that you've got to tell people what the higher purpose is. If you don't explain the higher purpose, then the job becomes menial. He said, I don't like doing budgets. That's a hard part of my job, trying to make ends meet and make sure that I have a balanced budget at the end of the year, and that I haven't overcharged, but I've charged enough to cover my costs. I hate that. But the higher purpose is, if I don't do that, the students don't get to eat. Well, I'm telling you that story because we've forgotten how to train our kids for the higher purpose. Yeah.
Have you shared that story with anybody else?
Oh, I've shared that story in speeches.
All right. I mean, it's a great story. The messaging is prophetic. And I think it's the sort of story that many of us don't have. But the influence that your dad had on you indirectly by you being in that room and listening has influenced you to where you are now, and then has allowed you to influence others by the sharing of that story and the messaging within it.
Well, the message is within is what's important. My dad taught me to teach through allegory.
Yeah, well, you do that good. Excuse me, you do that well. My mommy taught me how to use the correct words.
Correct words too, huh?
No, but I think again, the story came from the fact that you sat there and listened and you paid attention.
Yes.
And at the same time, you were doing your lessons and you were keeping your daughters,
My daughters,
your sisters, you were keeping your sisters under control.
Oh, I didn't say that. I just kept them quiet. We did a lot of kicking under the table.
The reason for all of this, and the reason that you were actually there, was because you had to be with your dad, who was the only one who could drive in case there was a problem for your sister, who was the asthmatic and having access to healthcare, et cetera. I mean, think about if you were not dealing with those medical issues and you had other people who drove in the family. Many of your growing up lessons that were a result of the challenges of growing up in the South during the 60s have had some very long-term benefits.
Oh, absolutely.
Challenges lead to benefits.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We don't always look at it that way.
No, we don't. No. Look, if I had been privileged, and I
Like
was,
me?
but yeah, like you. If I had been really privileged, I might have been a different man, but I would have had those lessons. I might not have ever become an administrator of any kind without those lessons.
Right. And again, we've talked about the lessons that you saw and the issues that you saw from a voting and guessing the marbles or whatever the paper bag stories were, and all of the different challenges that Mississippi was going through at that point in time, which brings us back to where this all started, which was right to vote, efforts to second guess democracy and the demolition of the keystone of American democracy and Declaration of Independence. I mean, it is an interesting civics lesson that we have shared today, hasn't it been?
Yes, and the importance of reintroducing civic lessons.
Yes.
So essentially, back to your question again, the solution that President Nelson would implement would be civics lessons at different stages, at multiple stages, counter propaganda, essentially. But I don't consider it propaganda when I'm focusing on principles, when I'm focusing on the higher purpose.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.